Hi, my name is Asma Khan, and I'm here with Bill Gent here in the UK Centre for the Study of Islam. And today we're going to be asking Bill some questions about his research work. Okay, Bill, first of all, first of all, welcome to the Centre.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming to Cardiff for us
Always
today.
nice to come to Cardiff.
Okay, can I just ask you how you first became involved in research and why you became interested in researching British Muslims?
Well, I think my academic background was religious education, and I was an RE teacher for 15 years, and one of the schools I taught at in Birmingham was something like 75% Muslim, so I had my exposure to pupils from an Islamic background. Never had enough time, though, as a teacher in school to find out much more about what made them tick, what they were doing. I was aware that they were involved in educational activities, and in fact for a while I had a small group of Muslims that I took around to primary schools to speak in assemblies. And I remember one of the boys who was very naughty, who in class, a 13-year-old, used to stand up and do the call to prayer in Arabic in these primary schools, and someone else showed the prayer positions and so on. And there was a fascination in that authenticity of what they were doing rather than just learning about it in books. So then in 1988 I went into advisory work, and I, again with religious education as my main field, that's in North East London, a place called Red Bridge, and very large Muslim community there. And in my advisory work, working with teachers in primary and secondary schools, I had to get to know the various communities. There's a very large Muslim community in Red Bridge, something like 28,000. And I began to get to know some of the people. I advised various multi-faith groups, got to know people there, and sometimes I organised multi-faith tours, which included one or other of the mosques in that part of London. And then as I got to know the Muslim community more and my own interests in education developed, I began to realise that there was a whole world of mosque classes that the public outside knew very, very little about. And then in the year 2000, I started a doctorate at Warwick University, an education doctorate, which is supposed to be geared to your professional interests and needs. And then I had to choose to do some field work, and I thought I'd take advantage of my contacts, and so I began then to get into the inside world of mosque classes and began trying to piece together what was going on there and the priorities and the philosophy behind it.
Okay, and can you tell me a bit about the methods you use for your fieldwork, because it's quite a rich ethnographic kind of description of the mosque classes.
That's right. I mean, as you say, it was ethnographic, and obviously behind all the fieldwork, there's a lot of background reading to try to make sense of what you're seeing, and in order to interpret it. It was in several stages, and in fact there were 3 stages really. First of all, I did some life story interviews, and that was I asked 5 Muslims living in Redbridge if I could interview them about their lives, because I wanted to place learning and education within a living person's context, rather than quoting a Quranic text or a hadith or something. I wanted to see how it fitted in. And so the first stage was 5 life story interviews, recorded, transcribed, huge. I mean, little did I realise then the amount of time it takes to transcribe it. I mean, it's often said, isn't it, 1 hour's interview equals 10 hours of transcribing afterwards and making notes. So that was my first stage. That was simply then interviews individually with people, two interviews with each of the 5. They saw the script after the first interview. They could correct and bring objects and artefacts along to exemplify if they wanted to, and they saw the final script too. And then from those 5 interviews, massive material, I began to draw out various themes and so on, and some lovely anecdotal stories, for example, about beginning to read the Quran in Punjab in pre-partition India by a man in his 60s, or a young woman in her 20s who was a Muslim teacher, who had a very, very bad experience with male mosque leadership figures. And I began to realise from that stage too that within the Muslim community, maktab, as I call it, mosque supplementary class education, was a very much a contested field. So there was a lot of arguments about it. A lot of people who would never ever send their children to a mosque to be taught by those teachers and so on. And so that was the first stage. Very rich evidence from those interviews. The second stage was when I, through the imam of this particular mosque, I began to look around the mosque, and he explained to me what was going on in the normal classes. Monday to Friday, would it be 4:45 to 6:45 every evening? Children from 4 to 17, 300 plus. And it's not easy as a non-Muslim Westerner to try to see what's going on. The sound takes you by surprise for a start. And there's something about the sound of learning is something which I'll touch on later in my lecture. And really that was basically a much drier process. I wasn't taking photographs, I did later. But of course, if you're going into... can I call it an alien territory? And a territory when you're being hosted, when you're a guest, you're very sensitive to protocol and to not pushing things too far. So at that stage, it was speaking with people, with imams, with teachers, looking at the literature, observing what was going on just lightly as we were walking around. And then again, writing that up and trying to make sense of how that fitted. And of course, all the time, you have this very oral sense of learning going on, and you have the dominance of Arabic and the Quran. And we, in fact, published something both for the local authority and for mosques at that stage, because it was of my opinion then, and still is now, that what goes on in these classes needs to be understood by both parties, rather than just ignored. It's a hidden world otherwise. And then the third stage, when I was going round, being shown around the girls and the boys' classes in this particular mosque, I was introduced to 2 Hifz classes. Now, as an RE teacher, I knew the word Hafiz, and most RE teachers do. We don't know much beyond that. And of course, then I had to draw the connection between Hifz and Hafiz, memorising the Quran by heart, which is what the boys in the Hifz classes were doing. And I suddenly realised if the general mosque classes were hidden, this was an even hiddener, if that's an English word, area of life. So then my final piece of research was spread over a couple of months, was a series of observations of one particular boy's Hifz class. Research never goes according to how you want to plan it, of course. So I had ideas of them filling in questionnaires and things, but as it turned out, it was doing observations. I began to take photographs there for various reasons, for memory recall, but also I found it fairly useful when I began to talk to the boys, to show them photographs and say, what do you think is going on here? Tell me what's going on inside this person's mind, as a way of them reflecting back on what they were immersed in every day. And so I observed, got the feel, did all the background reading, looked at the text they were using, and then began to interview with the boys, usually in pairs but sometimes singly. I kept careful records. I kept a research diary, because all sorts of thoughts came to you. I tried to interpret, for example, the physical pattern of what was happening, because it's quite unlike a Western non-Muslim classroom, of course. It has a different theory. It's very much like an apprenticeship model here. And the role of the teacher is different. The role of orality is different. So after 2 months, again, I had a mass of data, pictures, interview records, notes, background reading, and again, I tried to make sense of it and try to do that sympathetically, in the sense of saying, because I was conscious that the Western non-Muslim will often be very cynical about things like memorization. I was saying, now, what is it about this tradition that's kept us going for 2,000 years? What are the dynamics of this tradition? And I was trying to understand that.
And if somebody wanted to have a closer look at your work, is your thesis available anywhere for them to have a look at?
Well, it hasn't been published in full yet. I mean, there are various parts which are being published. Yes, I mean, there is a journal called the Muslim Education Quarterly, which is published by the Muslim College in Cambridge, and they published an article on those life story interviews. There's a book by Professor Bob Jackson at Warwick, which has a chapter on an overall view. The British Journal of Religious Education will be carrying a further article about this work and so on. So as I find the time, gradually these things are coming on stream. But if people were to email me, I'm very happy to send them an electronic version.